Hey, gun people. All right, let's talk about the Glock, the most hated and most loved gun out there. I know I'm gonna get the anti-Glock Tupperware gun haters of plastic, and they'll be coming here talking about the M&P or Smith and Wesson or the copycats, and they'll be praising them. But for some reason, because Glock is just a great gun, and I really can't find much fault with it, somehow it's going to attract haters. So I'm a big Glock fan. Been through the Glock Armory School. I'm a Glock firearms instructor. I like Glocks. I don't consider myself a brainwashed. Glock is the only gun. It's the absolute perfect gun. There's nothing wrong with it, and it above all guns, all other guns should be destroyed except the Glocks. I'm not in that camp. However, I do think it's extremely functional. I own a few of them. I own a lot of 1911s. I own a lot of different type of guns, Smith & Wesson revolvers. I mean, you name it. I've probably either owned it or I do own it. And I'm telling you, Glock is my go-to. It's what I carry on a car. It's what I carry on my hip. And I know when I pull my Glock out and I pull that trigger, the gun's going to go bang. So I kind of want to go over and take some clips from a couple of armor courses and discuss some things about the gun that either the haters won't ever know because they don't handle it, but if you own one or you've had one for a while or you've taken it down, sometimes it can get a little iffy on taking it down. So I'm just going to make this one video, and it may get lengthy, and just give some tips and tricks and basically everything you want to know about the Glock except what I don't know. So let's take a look at some things here. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit of the Glock here, and I'm not a huge, proponent of everything has to be. I know on the internet everybody likes you got to use the right word, and you got to call a bullet a cartridge, and safety, and this, and back strap, and front strap. I mean, you got the back, the front. I get there's trigger guard. I'm not into a bunch of names. I'm into functional and understanding it. So it may be a turnoff for somebody that's looking for specific names, but you have your ejector here, your extractor, your trigger's got the little extra safety here. I don't know if you can see it. It's got a little bitty piece right here. It's got the serrated edges so you can grab it and do what I call a slingshot or pull back, rip and grab, whatever you want to call it. Most guns have these, some don't. Depending on which variation you have on this gun, it's usually got one or two pins. It's got a pin right here that holds all the trigger mechanisms in, and it's usually got one or two pins right here. Some of the Glocks have one pin. And then you have your little takedown lever, which is your blocking mechanism. And we'll get more into the technical terms when I put in clips from the Glock armor here on how the Glock works and what its function is. Now, this part right here is a lot of people, they don't take out this little bitty piece right here, and that's how you pull your trigger out. That needs to come out every once in a while. On my Glock video on cleaning, I showed how to pull that out, and maybe I'll splice a little bit of that in. You're going to see right below this pin here is a little plastic bushing. You saw that move back and forth? If I press in right here, this will go down. And then when I pull that back, that's going to click and it's going to move up. Okay? So, when you move that up, right in between there, you're going to see a little plastic casing right there. That's what you want to push down. That tension, I'm pushing it down this way. That tension relieves pressure so I can... So, I mean, that's how you get that little piece out. But if you look here, if you want some specs on this to kind of figure out, there's plenty of sites that you can find out technical information. I'm kind of trying to put out a little bit of real world so you can actually work on your own gun and do things that you need to do with it. And if you're looking for history, the Wikipedia page has how it was designed, when it was done, what the standards were on how it had to be self-loading, had to, not have so many jams. I think it could only have like 20 jams or something. Yeah, here we go. No more than 20 malfunctions were permitted in 10,000 rounds of being fired. You had to be able to clear it without any things. After firing 15,000 rounds, ammunition had to be inspected. So this was the requirements on this gun. And I'm telling you, most law enforcement, and to me, anybody that wants a reliable weapon should probably be carrying a Glock. And it may sound like in this video that I'm a Glock worshiper, but it's just a reliable gun. I've seen it in law enforcement as the armor for my agency. I watch guys neglect, not clean, not take care of their guns. Most cops aren't real gun guys. People think they are, but they're not. And I'm telling you, these guns can take a beating and keep on going, and they always work. They even work with the wrong ammo. So when a Glock is locked forward, there's a locking block in there that slides the barrel. And you'll notice when you pull your Glock back, your barrel will move up and down. And this little video cut right here shows pretty good on how that works.
Right here. Section right here is the bottom of the barrel. This white section right here is the cam. You can see that as the slide is withdrawn to the rear, the bottom leg on the barrel catches our locking cam and pulls the barrel down, allowing our slide to cycle to the rear. When it goes forward, that cam hits, forces the barrel up into the locked up position.
So, again, without a cutout gun, it's hard to see. I mean, when you go to the Glock Armory School, they have all these cutout guns. If you have somebody working your gun, a lot of them have the cutouts. But it really helps to understand if you're going to be cleaning or taking apart, or if you have problems with your gun, if you understand how it works and how the parts meet and where the wear parts are, and what the gun is doing will tell you where to look in the gun. It just gives you a better understanding of a piece of equipment you're carrying. And here's another view to where you actually see the barrel kind of drop down when it's cocked back. It drops down and then it pushes back up, so you understand. And here they discuss about the trigger and how the trigger works. You'll notice he's pressing down on this trigger safety, which moves the trigger block out. Most people on a Glock understand that. This video kind of shows it in a nice good close-up. See that little piece right there?
If I pull the trigger without pulling the safety or deactivate.
See, he's pulling it without it, and then when you press it, it moves it out of the way. So that's a good understanding on how that trigger safety works. Now, the problem with that is if something gets in your trigger and pulls it, it can remove that and do that. And I've got a picture of a holster that actually caused that. So on this holster, you could tell over time, this holster caused an accidental discharge, or people will come here, it's negligent, it's not, all right, whatever. So the holster, because of the way it was carried, got bent and indented here, and that was able to push that safety off when he shoved the gun in a holster and the gun went off. And Glock is notorious for people blaming the gun for firing. The gun doesn't fire unless you pull the trigger or you stick something in the trigger to manipulate the trigger. Glocks do not just fire. They are a very safe gun. And, I mean, I've never had an AD with it. I can't remember even seeing someone have an AD other than them sticking their finger in there and pulling the trigger, or trying to take it apart, and you have to pull the trigger to take it apart, and they didn't clear the gun, so there's a round in the chamber. They want to take their gun apart. They pull the trigger in order to take the gun apart, and boom, the gun goes off. So in this little cutout right here, this is your trigger bar, and your plunger is up here, which releases your firing pin safety. So when you pull the trigger, this bar moves into this little plunger, pushes it up, which allows that piece in the previous video where I was showing you how to take it apart to move back and forth. And this video is going to show that in pretty good detail. So you pull the trigger bar comes back and hits the plunger and pushes the plunger up. So that's what happens when you pull the trigger. And that trigger bar that you saw moving back that's connected to the trigger gives a little bit of view right here. That's what pushes back on the plunger. When you pull back on the trigger, this plunger pulls back and pushes up the plunger. So you'll notice this trigger bar comes all the way back here where your striker's at, and it's one piece, so it's going to move back and forth. And this video shows it moving back and forth. Right there, the whole thing moves back and forth. And this is a close-up shot of that plunger that it pushes up and down there. Now when you pull the trigger bar back here comes down and slides down, and this is the two parts that I usually polish when I get a Glock. I polish this area right here very good, because anytime you have moving parts that connect, if you smooth them off, it makes your trigger pull smoother. So in this cutaway, it's very easy to see how these work right here. Watch this go down, and that
When it comes back, hits that inclined plane and moves down. That's our connector. That's our connector.
if you look at the top view from the striker, and they call this the striker, when you pull the trigger, it actually cocks the spring. It's a firing pin. I call it the firing pin. Glock calls it a striker. It compresses this spring back, and then when the gun fires, this spring forces the firing pin into the bullet. And you watch this here. It goes back and forth, and it lets go. So when you're pulling a trigger, a lot of things are happening on Glock. And he explains this striker and pull back and sear and all this pretty good. I'm going to let this play through on him.
There you can see it. As the trigger bar is forced down by the inclined plane on the connector, the sear portion of the trigger bar is pulled down away from the striker. Once it leaves the striker is then allowed to fall and strike the primer. On our non-cutaway gun, this is the tail on the striker. In our non-cutaway gun, this surface right here is the sear portion that grasps the tail on the striker, pulls it to the rear. If you look over here, here's our trigger bar, here's our connector. You can't really see the trigger bar come into contact with the connector because the gun is assembled. I'm going to pull the trigger, and you'll see the trigger bar and the sear portion move back and then down. As it moves down, it would release the striker, which would fall. Now I'm going to pull this out just a little bit so you get a better view. Here's our connector right here. You can see what's going on. Now I am going to turn this around to show this surface right here, and our trigger bar is forward. You see it moves back and then it opens up. So our distance here is quite a bit greater than up front. This is a safety feature. So this is the position when the gun is loaded and closed with a round in the chamber, or the gun in the uncocked but ready to fire mode. What I mean by that is the striker is held on the back of the trigger bar sear surface, held in that position, ready to be withdrawn, compressing the firing pin spring, and be dropped to hit the primer. The sear portion of the trigger bar can't drop down in this position until you pull the trigger. Once you pull the trigger, it will move back, and then it comes to that clearance to where it can drop down and release the striker.
And here's a good picture of when you fire the gun, your ejector and your extractor. So your extractor here, again, it hooks the bullet and pulls it back, has us pulling it back. The ejector is that sharp point that sticks out on the frame there. That hits the back of the bullet and flips the bullet out and throws it to the side. Pretty common on most all revolvers. Ejectors, extractors are pretty much standard on most all guns. In this part, he gets into the trigger spring and the disconnect. This is just a lot of little technical. I mean, if you're taking it apart, it goes in the same way it comes apart, but just in case you want to understand how this works, we'll take a look at it.
It connects to the trigger housing here in the back, and up underneath this portion of the trigger bar, the crucifix section, and this is the sear portion, but up in here, it connects to the other end there. As you pull the trigger, we move back and down, releasing our striker. Our slide comes back and pushes our connector over, disconnecting the gun. I'm going to push this over with a punch. See how the trigger bar jumped up? That spring is pulling the drawbar back and up. Up is pretty important because now, because the slide would be cycling to the rear, as the slide returns forward, the tail on the striker will catch here, pushing this forward, reconnecting. Pull our trigger, it moves down, our striker falls and fires. Again, slide cycles, pushes this over, and that trigger spring pulls our drawbar and sears.
And this part kind of pretty much shows the slide stop, how it pushes up and stops it on the last round. When you take this out, it's pretty easy to see this part. It kind of gives us function there. Slide a magazine in. It pushes this part up, and that makes the slide stop go. And if you've never taken out a magazine spring and Glock, it can be a little tricky. You have to pull the spring to the left and pop it out of this little groove here in order to take out the magazine catch or the magazine push. if you want to change your magazine release button. So this video kind of shows it moving. So when you press it, it goes in and out there, and that's the back. That's on the frame. There's not a whole lot of reason to pull this out. As Glock recommends, the gun have a complete breakdown once a year. So as a Glock armorer, we would pull all these apart, clean it, make sure there wasn't any grit or debris down there. But is it necessary? Not a real critical area. I've never seen a gun fail because of this. But you know what? I'm kind of particular about my gun, so I tend to clean mine every once in a while. So this is a good view of your slide lock. When you take down a gun, you have to pull the trigger in order to take it apart, and you slide this back and you pull down on your slide lock. This shows a pretty good view of it that goes up and down there. And Glock, if you got an older Glock, your extractor will be smooth. In the newer Glocks, they put a little ridge here that allows you to feel when there's a round. See this little ridge here? So if there's a round in the chamber, this will stick out, and you rub your hand across it, and you can feel that that's sticking out. It's just another advancement that Glock has made over time so you can use your gun at night or something and tell if there's a round in the chamber. Most guys are going to check their guns. They do what's called a press check to make sure they have a round in the chamber before they go into an operation. This is a key part when you pull out the plunger, when you take out this back area of the gun and you pull your trigger out and your plunger. Glock designs metal on metal and plastic on plastic. This back piece of the Glock is plastic, so you want your plastic meeting plastic. And your extractor is metal, so you want that metal piece touching on metal. That's real important. I've seen these put in backwards. The gun still works, but it's not the way it was designed. When you put it in backwards, this plastic piece ends up hitting metal, the metal hitting plastic, and that's not, they want the same materials coming in contact with each other. Another point that Glock, I think, did a good job on is this spring right here on this plunger forces this plunger forward on the extractor, which really makes your extractor want to hang on to that bullet. So is this spring get dirty much? Not really. It's in the housing. It still needs to be cleaned, but when I pull it out, you know, you always want to check any spring for wear or possible cracks. This is another view of how the plunger and the firing pin and your trigger bar all works. Remember when the trigger bar pushes back, it pushes up on this plunger? Well, this shows the little plunger here. So the plunger sits in like that, right in that groove right there. And when you're pull the trigger and the trigger bar comes back, it raises that, which releases, which allows your gun to fire. That's why they call it the safe action. There's all these safeties. Everybody thinks the little trigger is the only safety, but this is a good mechanical safety that the trigger disengages when you pull it. So it's not just the trigger. There's this safety that keeps it from being fired unless you pull the trigger. That's why when people are talking about Glocks fire all the time for no reason, I'm like, Glock can't fire unless you pull the trigger. It has to move this plunger up, as he's showing here. When you pull back, it won't go back unless it's moved up to give it room to go in there. And another tip while we're on this, taking this spring off your firing pin, there's two little couplers right here, and these little black things are very easy to lose. They're very small. I show on my video where I take it down on how to get them out easy and how to put them back in, but be very leery when you take the spring off. You have to compress the spring, which gives you a little gap here, and you can take these two little plastic couplers off. Don't want to lose those. They're kind of a pain, so be careful. This is a good picture of the back plate that I showed that maintains the trigger inside. When you slide that in, it prevents your trigger mechanism coming out, and that little round cutout right there is what fits in there, and that's what you're pulling the pressure off when you press down. That sits in there. So when I was talking about putting pressure to remove this firing pin and pushing down, if you go back to the start of this video where I showed a little clip of where I was taking the gun apart, this is the piece I pushed forward, and I stuck my pin right in there, and I pushed this plastic piece down to remove it off here so I could slide this piece off. So the pressure of this spring here, pushing this plastic into here, keeps this piece from coming off. So in order to pull this piece off, you have to release that pressure by compressing the spring and pushing this down, and then it allows you to slide that back plate off. And this is a good little cutout view on what happens when you pull the slide to the rear, how it gets around, how it goes, and how it reaches the breech face and goes into the barrel. And again, most of your semi-automatics have this same design. Glock's a little bit different, but if you'll look in this picture here, you know, the round goes up in as you slide the slide back, and when it sets right here, it's going to be pushed into that ramp. I always polish my ramps. You don't want to polish it to where you're removing metal, but smoothing it out and make sure there's no rough edges just eases the bullet to going in easier. So the bullet gets pushed in, and as it gets pushed up and forward, it loads into the round, and then that's the face of the thing. As it's sitting in here, you'll notice the extractor. If I can move this down a little bit here. The extractor, that spring, that metal on metal we talked about, that metal is pushing the extractor forward, which makes it clip on to that round, cartridge, bullet, whatever everybody's going to be here complaining on what to call it. And then that makes a nice solid link up there. And then when you pull back, of course, it's going to rip the bullet out and pull it backwards. And as it comes back, that extractor's pulling on the bullet. And as it gets out, it hits the ejector, which pushes it to the right. And there it flies out. So there's different generations of Glock. When it first came out, these finger rails weren't here on the grip, and these thumb rests weren't here. In Gen 3, I think, Gen 2, they changed a couple things. In Gen 3, they put these nice thumb rest here on both sides of the gun for your thumb to have a place to sit, and they put the finger grips. Some people like them, some people don't. You can file them down, or there's all kind of modifications you can do. Also in Gen 3s, they put that little lip on the extractor talked about earlier, so you can tell when there's a round in the chamber that sticks out. When there's no round, it's flush because the extractor is all the way in. When it's hooked onto a bullet, it forces it up, and then you can feel that. Another change is they had one pin in the earlier Glocks, and now the later Glocks have 2 pins, but I think some of the newer Gen 4s might have went back to 1 pin, depending on the size and thickness. And in Gen 4, they changed the recoil spring. It used to be the flat wire. On the newer ones now, they went to the coiled wire or the round wire, and they went to the steel follower. I don't know if all Gen 4s have steel. I've upgraded some of my older ones to steel followers, but the tube in the middle here is plastic. So if you got an old one with plastic, works fine, never had a problem. I've never seen one break. I'm sure they have broken. I'm sure out of the millions of guns that Glocks has, I mean, these guns are put through, so you're going to have some failures. Nothing's perfect. But in all my use and all the cops tearing them up and treating them like crap, I've never seen one go down or have a problem. Again, even when they put the wrong ammo in and fired it. Now, because the Gen 4s made the magazine release on both sides ambidextrous, you can switch it if you want your mag release on the other side. The Gen 4 mags have a release for both sides. The older mags only have the release on the other side. So if you switch your magazine release with using older mags, it's not going to work. So that's just something to be aware of if you get a Gen 4 and you have older mags and you plan on switching. If you don't switch it, I don't think it matters. This is a trick that most people, if you buy a gun, will tell you. Somebody that's a Glock guy will tell you. I see people trying to do the slingshot method and pull the slide back while they're trying to pull the disconnector, or I can't think of the name right now, but you have to pull this down in order to release the Glock slide forward. But you have to pull the trigger, and once you pull the trigger, if you pull the slide back too far, it recocks the trigger and you can't pull this down. And this is a big area that people complain about taking a Glock apart. Once you learn to grab the gun like this with your thumb upside down and your fingers on top, you can move the gun just a little bit and it makes it easier. Right there, that little movement, that's all you need in order to pull that down. And once you get that down, it's much easier to release that, and then it slides forward and comes off. Most people know how to get the recoil spring and barrel out. You kind of push the spring forward, it comes out, then you pick the barrel up, and it will come out like so. Not real hard to get the Glock fill stripped. Getting the recoil spring back into a Glock sometimes gives people problems because there's two little indents here. And it's the one that's most forward that the spring. If you put the spring in right here, the Glock won't go together, and I've had people say my Glock won't work. I took it apart, I can't get it back. This is normally the problem. This has to be straight when it's in the gun. So watch this click here all the way down to that second one. And then it fits flush here. If it's sticking up, you've connected it to the wrong one. And I think he shows a picture here. So right here, this forward one is the one it clicks on. And it sets in this little curved blanket or cradle here, so the spring sits down here. If you put the spring here and lock it here, your gun won't go back together. This shows a really nice picture of that sleeve I keep going back to, because this gives people a lot of... To take off this back plate, you have to get this plastic tube pushed forward in order to relieve tension. And there's just a little gap right in between here, your striker or firing pin, and you push that sleeve down, and that's the key to getting this out. And when you push that in and out, that spring works perfect, and you can take your slide off back strap easy. And then after you get that back plate off, you can just slide your striker and spring assembly off and your plunger out there. Then your extractor, spring, and plunger, that comes off. Comes right out. Getting the extractor out, again, this must be one of the newer gens because it's got that little bump right there. You need to push in the plunger in order to release this so you can pull this out. And as he demonstrates here, you push that in, release the tension, and then your extractor comes right out. Nice and easy. Okay, to get those two little plastic couplings off, there's a lot of ways to do this. I kind of set it in the back of the slide as I show in my video. In this video, he's shown a different way. He sets it on top of a little punch, which enables him to push down and release that spring tension. And then as he pulls the spring tension down, it allows you to grab those two little plastic couplers. And again, you don't want to lose those. And here's what they look like. Here he shows how to take the pins out. Your back pin on a Glock is plastic. Usually your front pins, because it connects to plastic. Remember, plastic on plastic, metal on metal. Your two front pins connect to metal, so they've got them as metal. But when you push this out, that pin right there kind of holds down your block here, but the next pin releases your slide stop or slide release, if you want to call it. Moving that back and forth, which he will demonstrate here, he does a nice job. It's nice to use this video because he's got someone else working it. See how he moves that back and forth there? That really helps moving that back and forth. You actually want to do that while you're pushing down on this, because there's a little groove on this pin that this sits in. And if you push on it without moving this, it's very hard, and it's made not to come out, because actually that groove helps hold that pin in. So this is a step that a lot of people miss, and I think I showed on my other video, but here it's a nice view. When you're pushing down here with downward pressure, you want to move this back and forth while you're putting downward pressure, and that will help make that pin comes out a little bit easier, and you'll be like, it won't come out, won't come out, and then as you move it, it works. And here's a good picture after it's out on how that slide stop fits in these little grooves right here. That's what's holding this pin in, is those little grooves. And unless you release that tension or get it good surrounding that, it's hard to get that pin out. Once both those pins are removed, this locking block right here will slide right out. And again, I think I showed that, but he gets a nice close-up footage right here of how to just pull that out nice and easy. And once that locking block is out, your whole trigger assembly, your trigger bar and disconnector, everything just comes right out. And that's your whole assembly there. Now, I don't take out the slide lock a lot, but sometimes I will, or if you want to replace it, they have an extended slide lock you can buy. And replacing this, there's a little bitty spring right here that you have to press down in order to release the tension so it will press down, and then that will just slide right out, left or right, either side. And it comes right out. Man, I like this guy's camera. Who's ever got working a camera, he's getting some nice, good views of this, and it's just hard to do that when you're making a video by yourself. So, again, pushing down on this releases that tension. When you slide this back in, you're going to need to push this down in order to slide that back in. Now, the back side of that little slide lock shows this little groove here, and that's where this piece right here fits in there. So when you slide it back in, you push this down, this slides across, and when it gets right in the center, this spring here pops right in there and holds that in. Now, I don't take this spring out much. Some people do if you're doing a complete breakdown, but if you just, it slides straight down at this point, straight in. But because you're pressing at an angle and you're putting force, sometimes it's a little difficult, but it should come straight up. And as you can tell, as he puts pressure on there, it slides straight up and it'll just pop out. And it's coming down, and when it goes back in, it'll go right back in that same area. This is a really good camera shot of that magazine spring. If you're taking out your magazine release button, I talked about it earlier. You push and you pull in here. He describes this very well. I'm going to go ahead and let him do that.
Here's the spring. I'm going to push the magazine catch. See that? That's how our magazine catch works. Now you can see the notch right there. The spring has to be moved over and out that notch. I'm trying to do it where you guys can see. Now I'm using a split screwdriver. Try it first. Grab that spring. Grab that spring, move it over and out of the notch. And the magazine catch out.
And that's how the magazine comes out. Pretty easy. I mean, I can do it with a regular punch. I use a Glock tool or a flat screwdriver. You don't need that groove screwdriver to do that. You just need to put pressure this way and get it up through the notch. So that's pretty much on how to, I guess, clean, take apart. Good tips, good video footage. Hopefully it helps. You know, I said I'm not into the numbers because Glock just has too many numbers. I mean, there's people out there that know all these numbers. I can't keep up between a 17, a 19, a 19X, a 40, a 29, 23, 35, 28, 33, 39, 30. I mean, I know my 45, regular 45 is a 21. And then I know they made a 30 and a 36 for smaller, 36, 41. I don't even know what half these. I mean, again, I'm not a Glock worshiper, but some people like to learn all these numbers, and it drives me nuts when I'm checking out Glocks for sale. They never put what round the Glock shoots. They expect everyone to know every gun that they're looking for. So I guess if I was looking for a 9mm, I would know 17, 17L, 18, 19, 19X, 26, 34, and 43 of the Glock are all 9mm. Really? Maybe it's just me. I just don't have time to figure out all these damn numbers. You know, people are like, you're a Glock armor, you're a Glock instructor, you should know them. Whatever. I don't know the numbers. You want to study these? Knock yourself out. And if that slide wasn't good enough, you can go to Glock's site on usglock.com, and they have all their different brands. And if you click on them or hold your mouse, it'll tell you Gen 4, SF, or whatever. I mean, the numbers out there are crazy. Again, I don't keep up with it. That's not really important to me. It's important to me is how the gun functions, how it works, can I fix it, how to take it apart, how to clean it and put it back together. Hopefully this video gave you a little insight on some Glocks. Again, I'm a fan. I like them. I've used them. I've seen them abused. I've seen them work. I haven't seen them malfunction. I haven't seen them have problems. I like them. I carry them. They're always going to shoot. They're safe guns. The people that run around and tell you they fire all the time are idiots, because when Glock fires, somebody stuck something in a trigger well and pulled the trigger. That's the only way Glock fires. All right, we'll end that there.